So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk tonight, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to the organisers of the event, and also, of course, to Waterstones for hosting it, and to the team at Policy Press who were brave enough to publish this book. You see, publishing a book is very different from writing a book. It's much more dangerous. Publishing is much more dangerous than writing, because you write in private and you thoughtfully craft all these wonderful sentences, and then when you come to the publishing part of it, all your thoughtful sentences are subjected to the scrutiny of people who talk about grammar and punctuation and the difference between that and which as ways of joining bits of sentences together. We had a lot of discussion about that, and I still don't know what the answer is. But the point of saying that is that I am really grateful to Policy Press for their enormous help, patience and professional skill in producing this rather weighty book. It's quite heavy. I weighed it. It weighs 8 times as much as the first book I ever published, which makes me a bit worried about what happens if I write another. But at the moment I don't think I will write another. See, I think writing books is like childbirth. Afterwards, you know you can never possibly do it again. And then with the passage of time, you begin to think, well, perhaps it's possible that I might do it again. But I haven't got there yet, not with writing a book. So, this is a book full of women. The women are the title who were committed to both peace and welfare. And it's got lots of photographs in it, because I felt it's a good idea to have photographs. I needed the photographs. I needed to be able to visualise them when I was writing these stories about their lives. So the book is really a set of stories about intersecting cohorts of women who were mostly born in the last decades of the 19th century, and they were active in the period between about 1880 and 1920, though parts of the book, I could not leave it at 1920, I had to go on a bit to say something about what happened later. So, the work of these women occupied 4 different areas of public life. Actually, they're not different areas, that's the point, but they are treated differently in history, in the mainstream history. So, what are the areas? The first area is the one we all know about, and that is women's struggles for the vote and for the benefits of citizenship, which had been denied to them for so long. The second area they worked in was developing the tools of social science, which is something as a social scientist I was quite fascinated to find out about. So there they were, and they were beginning to use methods like in-depth interviewing and case histories and cohort studies and all the tools of social science that we know and don't always love today, but there they were, and they were developing them. And they were doing so in an effort to study social conditions, to study the kinds of appalling social conditions that had accompanied rapid industrial and urban development in many places in Europe and in North America. And then the third area that women worked in was what we would today call evidence-based public policy. I think they were really the founders of the idea that policymakers, politicians, should not introduce policies that have not been shown to be effective and to achieve the goals that they are supposed to achieve. And the fourth area the book is about is the Pacifist Movement, the investment of many of these women in the idea that pacifism has to be an essential component of any welfare society. And I think to me there is a quite inescapable logic about this, about the argument that the very concept of welfare implies that you have to avoid warfare. How can you really have a society committed to ensuring the public good through publicly provided welfare services at the same time as promoting aggression and militarism as ways of solving domestic and international conflicts? Of course, this is a particularly topical issue today. The basic argument here is that an ideology of combat on an international level can only encourage fighting of all kinds at home, and indeed even inside homes. There are close associations between violence, particularly towards women at home, and violence on a national and international level. These women, the women in my book, were involved in lots of other social movements, which I am not going to talk about, but I find fascinating, and I had to avoid being dragged into researching. So they were also members of movements, for example, dress reform, giving up corsets and silly hats and flowing skirts and all that. Vegetarianism, a lot of their international meetings, at the end of the agenda it says there will be a conference dinner in a vegetarian restaurant. It's amazing how many vegetarian restaurants there were in the early 1900s. We think these things are new, but a lot of them really are not. And bicycle riding was another thing they were into. And I think there really is a history to be written here about the role of the bicycle in women's emancipation. And I'm not going to write that. So the point is, the women worked in these 4 areas whose histories are written separately, and because they're written separately, we are prevented from seeing how the different histories are connected with one another. And we also, of course, don't usually get to know much in standard histories about what women in general did. Men created the welfare state, didn't they? Peace movements, where they've existed, have been led by men, haven't they? And where did social science come from, if not from the heads of men such as Charles Booth, with his mammoth survey of the life and labour of the London poor, and the work of male academics in the early American universities who sat in their offices and theorised about society, rather than actually getting their hands dirty by studying it. So one of the aims of women, peace and welfare is to debunk these kinds of myths, that it was all men's work. It wasn't. The women were there all the way along, and even sometimes before the men. There are 324 women in my book, and that is only a selection from a much longer list of possible names. And I think the organisers of this event were a bit worried that I might try and talk about all 324 of them, because they sent me an email saying, perhaps you could just concentrate on 2 or 3. So, I always do what I'm told. I've chosen 3 women to talk to you about. 1 each from Britain, America and Germany. 3 women born in 1876, 1858 and 1872 respectively. And the work of these 3 women does illustrate the main story of women, peace and welfare, which is the concern of women reformers with issues of human rights that were far broader than the effort to secure citizenship for women. The 3 women I've chosen also all lived till a relatively good age. One of them actually didn't die until the age of 105 in 1964, which suggests that they knew something important about how to live. And many women in the book, in fact over a third of the 324, were still alive in 1950, which tells you how recent a history a lot of this is. 1950 may sound like a very long time ago to some of you, but a lot of us were there, won't we? And we remember it. So the first woman is the one who lived to 105. She was an American scholar and black rights activist called Anna Julia Cooper. Have you heard her name? Anyone? Right, every American passport carries a quotation from her writing, and the quotation says, "The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race or a sect, a party or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity." Anna Julia Cooper was born into slavery in North Carolina in 1858. She was the daughter of a slave and of either her mother's white slave owner or his brother, according to the custom of the time, which enabled men who owned women to also abuse their bodies. Anna Julia Cooper did go to school. She went to school when she was about 9 to a special school set up for slave children, where she showed an enormous appetite for learning and was particularly good at mathematics, Greek and Latin. I just find these sorts of stories completely amazing. And she took degrees later at a college for black students. She took degrees in maths and classical languages. She married her Greek teacher, who sadly died 2 years later, leaving her a widow at 21. After that, she had a legendary career in education and in activism, and she became a well-known speaker for the rights of black women who were, as she put it, doubly enslaved. Anna Julia Cooper helped to run a social settlement for black people in Washington. There was an institution called the Coloured Social Settlement. And there's a chapter in my book, chapter 3, which is about the importance of these organisations, social settlements, all over Europe and America as places where women reformers particularly lived and worked and developed a lot of the early welfare services. In 1900, Cooper came to the UK, to London, with another Anna Jones, who was also born in slavery, and they both spoke at the first big international meeting to address racism, the Pan-African Conference. And Anna Julia Cooper helped to draft a memorandum at this event, which was sent to Queen Victoria. It was a memorandum about the appalling treatment of the British colonial government of South African people. The memorandum protested about the system of indentured and compulsory labour in South Africa, about the segregation of black and white, especially in public places, and about the denial of property and voting rights. And we don't know whether Queen Victoria ever read this memorandum. I suspect not. The archives record that a minion replied in suitably wishy-washy terms, you know, thank you for your interest, that sort of thing. So, Anna Julia Cooper was not best known for that memorandum. She was best known in her lifetime for two things. The first of these was an astonishing book, which was published in 1892, and it's called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South. It's a collection of essays on racism, sexism and education, and it takes a very modern approach to discussing the position of women in a social system which is arranged on the axes of both race and class. She talks in this book quite a lot about how this manifested itself in her daily life. For example, she said, when she travelled around the southern states, she would encounter commonly two public toilets. One of them was labelled for ladies, and the other one was labelled for coloured people. And she could never work out which one she was supposed to go into. But when you read A Voice from the South today, you find it really contains an elegant defence of cultural diversity. For example, in her book, Cooper said that exclusiveness and selfishness in a family, in a community, or in a nation is suicidal to progress. The community that closes its gates against foreign talent can never hope to advance. Resolve to keep out foreigners and you keep out progress. Now, wouldn't it be nice if certain people heard that? That was 1¼ centuries ago, she said that. One of the important elements in Anna Julia Cooper's approach was the emphasis she put on black women sharing this condition of oppression with all women and with other minorities who were also denied human rights. The cause of women, she said, would not be won until it was recognised that everyone was entitled to life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Women's wrongs, she wrote, are thus indissolubly linked with undefended woe, and the acquirement of her rights will mean the final triumph of all right over might, the supremacy of the moral forces of reason and justice and love in the government of the nations of the earth. So note a bit about the triumph of right over might and the role of love, not power or militancy, in international relations. Pacifism was a key part of Cooper's philosophy. The second event in her amazingly long life that attracted attention was a political fight that developed around her role as the principal of the first public high school for black students in Washington. She strongly believed that education was the key to emancipation, and that everyone had the right to a full liberal arts curriculum. In this she came into conflict with the famous Booker T. Washington, who was the political leader of the African American community at the time. Booker Washington thought that black students should focus on vocational skills and industrial arts. They shouldn't be exposed to the normal higher education curricula. And this disagreement between Booker Washington and Anna Julia Cooper resulted in her dismissal from her position as principal of the school. It's amazing how often when men and women disagree, it's the women who get to suffer. But the thing about her, like many of the women in my book, is she never gave up. She worked in higher education until she was 82, and her own most remarkable educational achievement was the acquisition of PhD in 1925, when she was 66, from the University of Paris. The title of her dissertation, which was written in French, was The Attitude of France Towards Slavery During the French Revolution. So while all this was going on, she didn't have children herself. I might say a bit about that later, but she did bring up 7 orphaned children on a teacher's salary. In her last year, she composed a play about black history for university students. It was called From Servitude to Service, the Contribution from the Negro Peoples to American History, a pageant in 3 episodes and 14 themes. I have not been able to find it anywhere, but I would love to read it. And it would be nice if someone could perform it, perhaps. There's a challenge for somebody. So I don't know about you, but my main reaction to hearing stories like that is just admiration for the quality and quantity of achievements that were packed into such a life. How did she do it all, and when so much was stacked against her? And how have we forgotten not only what she did and who she was, but the powerful intellectual analysis she provided of the ways in which these different forms of oppression, racism, sexism and classism all interact, and how have we forgotten how the institutions of white male-led society are governed by principles of power, conflict and coercion rather than by altruism, peace and community. So that's woman number 1. And woman number 2 is British. She was also, the second woman, was also an intellectual and an activist, but her major concern, she was an economist, was with how the economic system of capitalism oppressed women and poor people and deprived them of human rights. Mabel Atkinson was born in Northumberland in 1876, and her mother was the opposite of Anna Julia Cooper's. She wasn't a slave, but she was a suffragette. So Mabel Atkinson and her mother went to suffrage meetings together. So Mabel Atkinson had a rather different childhood. But she led a life which is just as exhausting as Anna Julia Cooper's. I mean, they're both exhausting to read about, so they must have been pretty exhausting to live. In 1894, Mabel Atkinson was one of the first women students at the University of Glasgow, where, of course, it was found necessary to teach the women students in different rooms from the men. I don't know quite whether the idea was that the men needed to be protected or was the other way around. Well, she enjoyed, Mabel enjoyed the freedom of university education, and she enjoyed bicycle riding, you see, which she defined as the first great emancipation for women. So you can't get away from this theme of the bicycle. In the early 1900s, Mabel Atkinson was a founder member of an organisation that somebody definitely ought to write a history of, the Fabian Women's Society group. The Fabian Society was famous for many things, including its summer schools, which were occasions that mixed education and recreation. And these were Mabel Atkinson's idea. According to Fabian Beatrice Webb's diary, Mabel Atkinson's main contribution to these summer schools was that she did gymnastics on the lawn. And Beatrice very much disapproved of it. If you know anything about Beatrice Webb, you'll know that she disapproved of all forms of fun. So that's hardly surprising. Mabel Atkinson was apparently a rather difficult individual. It wasn't only Beatrice Webb who said she was difficult, other people did too. Like Anna Julia Cooper, Mabel Atkinson was a versatile public speaker, and she was known especially for the pacifist speeches she made during the First World War. The writer Virginia Woolf actually records in her diary going to listen to Mabel Atkinson, who, as Virginia Woolf put it, dribbled on about peace at a meeting in London in 1915. So Mabel had not as long a career as Anna Julia Cooper. She died at 82, but before that she retired 3 times, and 3 times went back to work, which is a model, I think, for all of us. In the summer of 1914, 2 important things happened to Mabel Atkinson. Firstly, she published a Fabian tract called The Economic Foundations of the Women's Movement, which was enormously influential. It was influential for a number of reasons, but one of them was that in this pamphlet, what Mabel Atkinson shows is that working women, employed women, are not new. Women have always worked. Women have always worked inside and outside the home for pay, not for pay. And what she showed is that many of the restrictions that 20th century feminists subjected to had only been introduced as a consequence of industrialisation. They were not there before that. In this pamphlet, Mabel Atkinson proposed state support for motherhood. This is what later became the family allowances movement, and she proposed this as a strategy for solving the problem of women and family life. She also said that if work was bad for women, because many experts at the time said it was bad for women, Mabel said, if work is bad for women, then housework is one of the first industries that ought to be banned. And this very modern approach to housework was also a theme in a textbook she wrote with a friend a few years later, which was called Economics, Descriptive and Theoretical. And this book spells out the principles of economics in a really user-friendly way, unlike the textbooks that I was told to read when I was studying economics in the early 1960s, and I never understood them. But when I read this book of Mabel's a couple of years ago, I thought, now I understand it all. But obviously my tutors had not heard of Mabel Atkinson. Now the other thing that happened to Mabel in 1914 is that she changed her name to Mabel Palmer by marrying an Australian journalist, about whom very little is known, except that she went off to fight, which probably didn't please her very much because she was, after all, a pacifist, and the marriage was soon over. So, the second part of her life, everything is under the name of Mabel Palmer. It took me quite a long time to work this out. I kept coming across these different references to 2 apparently different women who were actually the same woman. And I think some of the references were by people who simply hadn't twigged that Mabel Atkinson became Mabel Palmer. I mean, the whole issue of researching women, these kinds of stories, is, I won't go into because it's really, really tedious, but important. Anyway, in her new role as Mabel Palmer, Mabel carried out one of the first studies of poverty and infant mortality, which showed the literally fatal effect of poor social conditions on babies' lives. She also took a job teaching at a revolutionary and completely forgotten institution in London, which was called the King's College of Household and Social Science. This was set up in the early 1900s, and it lived for 45 years, and I can't tell you about it because I haven't got enough time. You have to read the book for that. So, what happened next to Mabel is she went to South Africa. Nobody knows why she went to South Africa, but there she went, after leaving her disappointing husband. And in South Africa, she taught economics at a university college and continued to work for progressive causes, including the League of Nations and the Black Trade Union movement. And there are some wonderful descriptions of her. She was known for, at meetings, she was quite large, Mabel was. She wore a green eye shade and very thick spectacles, and she knitted all the way through boring meetings. So, you know, you get this really vivid image of how she just got on with her own thing. So in 1936 she retired again, and then she started on a third career, campaigning to establish higher education for Black, Asian and other non-white students in South Africa. At first she held classes for them, unpaid, in her sitting room, and then she went on to become the director of the first university institution in South Africa for non-European education. And in this she was supported by Beatrice and Sidney Webb, who had become friends despite Beatrice's unkind comments about Mabel's gymnastics. And together they proposed the foundation of a global institute of interracial economics. It never happened, like, I'm afraid, quite a few of the visionary enterprises that appear in my book as elements in women reformers' ideas about the good society. They didn't happen because the forces of tradition were too much against them. So we have arrived at the third woman. And she is a German woman called Alice Salomon. She wasn't quite as much of an intellectual as the other two, but she did write a PhD on the causes of unequal pay for men and women 112 years ago in 1906. Alice Salomon, was the founder of social work in Germany and the initiator of all the early welfare services there. And these initiatives of hers and her whole vision of what social work ought to be was actually built on the British experience. She spent a lot of time here and also in America visiting social settlements and other women reformers. And she borrowed quite a lot of the methods that were used by the British social researchers here. She was also, I seem to be saying she was also quite a lot because they did such a lot. So Alice Salomon was also a leading pacifist in the transnational women's peace movement, and as a progressive Jewish woman, she was the target of Nazi persecution in the 1930s. Like many women of her generation across the world, she had to fight for access to education. When the Prussian universities were finally open to women in 1900, she managed to enroll, but she had to ask each lecturer individually whether he, they were all men, was prepared to teach her. In 1893, at the age of 21, she joined a group of young women reformers who wanted to do welfare work and who organised lectures on economics and social systems. She started working in a day nursery, and then she visited people in their own homes, people who were applying for public assistance, and that experience opened her eyes to the extent of poverty. She was particularly shocked by the case of one woman who was convicted of manslaughter through culpable negligence because one of her children had fallen into a wash tub and drowned while she was out working. The mother argued she was innocent because she had to go out to work in order to feed her children and there was no one to look after them. Alice Salomon defended her and blamed the lack of public welfare services for not doing more to help poor families and women like her. The problem, Alice Salomon said, was not the working mother, but the failure of the state to provide the right kind of support for family life. So the official policy at the time in Germany and elsewhere was to rely on the supposed self-healing power of a free market to sort out these kinds of problems. What Alice Salomon said was a free market means the exploitation of people who've got nothing to sell but their labour. And she also said that the whole ideal of the happy family blinded people's eyes to what was really going on. So she set up classes for training social workers, and she founded the first professional school of social work in Germany. And she and her co-reformers fought for the right kinds of protective labour laws for children, and then they fought for free school meals, which were needed in order to make up for the loss of the children's wages. You know, along the way, they set up the first children's courts with a special judge, and they set up a consumers' league to improve working conditions in shops and factories. And all this campaigning was, as I said a couple of minutes ago, very much done in collusion with other women reformers in other countries. So Alice Salomon made friends with people like Jane Addams and Hull House. Have you heard of the Hull House settlement in America? Well, Alice Salomon spent a lot of time there. And you know, the correspondence between these people is utterly fascinating in terms of the sharing of ideas and support and strategies for influencing policy, because that was what they all said. It isn't enough to do the research and to do the campaigning, we have to have an impact on policy. Alice Salomon was a vehement pacifist. She said once that war annihilates everything that social work tries to accomplish. She also said that above all, war fosters attitudes which are the source of social injustice and distress. It annihilates respect for property, it drills men to requisition, loot and steal. It instills hatred in the population. It paves the way for cruelty, for domination, for a belief in the superiority of one nation over another. And at the end of that speech she said, patriotism is not enough for the welfare of mankind. I find that an extremely powerful statement, and for me it connects back to the Versailles Treaty at the end of the First World War, 1919, which, as you probably all know, paved the way for the Second World War because it was a disaster. Now, women were excluded from the Versailles negotiations, and they were excluded because it was feared they would not be patriotic enough to defend the interests of their own nations. Anyone who was more interested in the global welfare of human beings than transnational harmony was not welcome. So Alice Salomon made no secret of her pacifism, and she fell out with many of the traditional women's organisations because of it. The photograph on the cover of my book is of an extraordinary meeting which was held at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1915, in the middle of the First World War. Alice Salomon wanted to go to it, but she was told by the National Women's Council in Germany that if she went, she would no longer be a member of their organisation. But her radicalism got her into much worse trouble in the lead up to the Second World War. In May 1937, she was summoned by the Gestapo, who interrogated her for hours about her international travel, apparently travelling and networking amongst women was regarded as particularly suspicious. And the Gestapo told her to leave Germany within 3 weeks or she would go to a concentration camp. So she went to America, where Eleanor Roosevelt invited her for tea in the White House, and she lived as a refugee in the USA for the rest of her life. The German authorities destroyed all her papers, which for anyone like me who is trying to find out about these suppressed histories just makes life really quite difficult. So preserving papers is really, really important. And if any of you have got important papers, don't throw them away, please. So I'm just going to end with a few lessons that I think I might have learnt in digging out these wonderful histories. So, you know, as I said, I found the amount and diversity of what these women did in very unfavourable circumstances simply amazing. So the question is, what were the kinds of resources that they drew on that helped them to do this? I think in a strange way, the fact that they were excluded from civil society was an aid as well as a hindrance. So they had nothing to lose but their chains, and Karl Marx's daughter Eleanor is in my book, of course. But the point being that they didn't have to respect the restrictive rules of masculine institutions. But it was difficult, and it did make things much more complicated. A lot of the social research the women reformers did was done outside universities, which since I've worked in universities nearly all my life, I find that particularly interesting, particularly these days when I think the restrictions that universities are putting on what people are able to do would have put some of these women off. But anyway, they said, we don't want to be part of academia, we want to be able to research and to publish exactly what we want to do. We want to influence the political process, and that is not what academics at the time were supposed to do. The thing about education, being able to have access to education was terribly important, and one of the things that it enabled these women to do was to speak each other's languages. A lot of them were fluent in 2 or 3 languages, which of course made it much easier at their international meetings for there to be genuine dialogue. There's one woman in my book, a Hungarian woman, called Rezika Chemin, who spoke French, German and English, Hungarian, Dutch, Italian, Norwegian and Swedish. Can you imagine that? And a lot of the women doctors they had to go abroad to finish their medical education. They couldn't do it here. So in the course of training as doctors, they picked up another language. And that was a help to them in their medical practice, but also in their campaigning. So these stories in Women, Peace and Welfare, I think, are above all stories about connections. They're about connections between people, between ideas, between countries, between classes, between different cultural groups, and between different areas of public and private life. I think I realised this after I finished the book. It wasn't part of the plan, but what I followed in the book is probably the general maxim of post-1960s feminist scholarship, which states that private lives can't be disconnected from public lives, and vice versa. They are connected. What we do in private, what we believe, and what we do in public, and what we say we believe in public are connected through one mind and one body. So it's not improper to comment on how the way someone lives may have influenced and be influenced by their ideas and their achievements. And there's quite a lot of that in my book. I wanted to find out how these women reformers lived and how the personal conditions of their lives might have influenced and been influenced by the work that they did. There's a long chapter in the book about domestic relations which discusses a theme I haven't mentioned tonight, and that is the importance to many of these women reformers of the close intellectual and personal bonds they formed with other women. Many of them had long-term relationships with female partners. These female couples shared interests, work interests, they wrote books together, they looked after each other, they looked after each other's parents, they went on holiday together, and they were often buried together. There's been a lot of speculation among some historians about the intimate side of this. Were these women lesbians? Did they have sex with one another? It's a question that has provoked a lot of salacious detective work amongst the hotel registers in the early 1900s, trying to find out whether, for instance, when Jane Addams from Hull House in Chicago was going away with her friend Mary Rosette Smith, did they have a double bed or not? There are an amazing number of articles in specialist feminist journals devoted to this subject. I think it's completely, utterly beside the point. What's important is that they lived like this, that they shared their lives like this, and of course there was a bit of a challenge for the men in their communities, I think, possibly in this. And do you know that the origin of the word gay, as applied to homosexual couples, is said to have originated with two of these American women reformers, Catherine Anthony and Elizabeth Irwin. They lived in a place called Gaylordsville in California, and they called themselves the Gay Ladies of Gaylordsville, and that's where the word comes from. Another aspect of personal life that is striking in many of these stories is what I mentioned earlier, is the absence of children. But there are an amazing number of stories of adoption in this book. For instance, did you know that Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel adopted 4 children between them? And they set up a special home for female orphans in West London. They furnished it with velvet armchairs and all sorts of unsuitable furnishings, and it didn't last very long, but that's another story. And of course, the shortage of biological motherhood amongst these women reformers does say something important about one of the welfare issues that they were campaigning about, and that is the lack of social and financial support available for mothers. Okay, 2 final points. This book is not a biography, but I suppose it can be regarded as a series of biographies. Biographers traditionally develop a certain attitude to their subjects. They like them, or they dislike them, or they feel ambivalent, or sometimes they feel jealous or puzzled. I said my main feeling about the women in this book is just one of admiration. But my other response is to feel completely humbled that they knew it all and said it all such a long time before the rest of us got round to it. When I came into the social science and policy world and the world of the women's movement in the 1960s and early 1970s, I thought I was making new discoveries. together with my friends and colleagues in these worlds, we thought we were establishing for the first time such ideas as the social and economic undervaluation of housework, the historical neglect of women's productive labour, the deceptive ideology of happy families, the social mistreatment of single women and motherhood, and the need for education to cover heroes and heroines of peace, as well as the other kind. But these were not original discoveries. They're all there in the history. And this is, I think, precisely why histories such as those in my book should not be forgotten. What is the point of pretending that something has been found out for the first time when it was known about long ago? How does that help us move closer to the vision of a good society? They didn't have visions, these women. That, I think, is to downgrade what they did. They had very exact and clearly worked out plans for the kind of society that would serve the public welfare best. Their plans were based on evidence about how people actually lived, evidence that they themselves had collected carefully and systematically. And the plans were based on facts about what kinds of interventions and strategies might work in making things better. But if we remember these women at all, we remember them because they have been called feminists. And because all the diverse things that they did have been put into this box called feminism. And they have been seen as part of women's struggle for the vote. Citizenship was certainly part of it, but it was only a small part. The good society women reformers wanted was a good society for women, men and children. It was a society that would be based on equality and mutual respect, and it would value all human rights. And as I said, it was a key part of this framework that violence in all its forms would be abolished. I'm losing my voice, which is suitable because I'm nearly at the end. So you see, peace and welfare were two sides of the same coin. And women were arguing that in order for these connections to be made on a national and international policy level, women had to be admitted to citizenship. That was the point about citizenship. It would bring the possibility of some of these changes just this little bit closer. And I think when I was researching this book, if they had had their way, some of them, not all 324, but just a few, where would we be now? Would we be in the same place? Or would we be in a different place? And that's, I think, why we have to remember them and why their stories should not be suppressed. Thank you.